let's get right into things. Hopefully, we can get this in before the next round of storms kicks up. Uh, as you know, I was AFK last week, so I piled up quite a bit of stuff during the last week to talk about, and I kind of pared that down a little bit to some things that I thought might be particularly helpful. First of all, in a thread that is focusing primarily on which antivirus software Mac users are using. We get this type of thread over and over from new members as they move into from Windows to the Mac world. We get this regularly, and we have a thread, an ongoing thread in the security awareness area. You might want to check that out. But also, this particular thread that I'm going to link to, I'm going to link to one specific post in this thread on this newest thread on AV software because member Randy B. Singer has come through again for us with links to a couple of ebooks that deal with Mac security in general. As you can see, the practical guide to Mac security, and has some things in it that are pretty helpful. One of the things that Randy is careful to do is to make a distinction between viruses and malware. And a lot of what is written these days, particularly what's coming from some of the antivirus manufacturers, does not make that distinction. We do see malware for the Mac, browser hijacks and things of that nature. We're not seeing so far actual viruses, that is, things that are self-replicating. And that's why sometimes you will see on the internet, Macs have viruses, no, Macs don't have viruses. That argument seems to be coming about in part because people are using different definitions of what is and isn't a virus. Some people are including malware in the discussion of viruses. Those are not generally the same things. And I thought these two ebooks might be good references for you to have a look at as you try to sort out some of this issue. All right, let's move on to a couple of other forum things before we get to the tips and tricks. And one of the tips I'm going to stick right here because it's relevant to this particular thread. All right, one of our members wanted to know about how you go about setting up your system to show you. He's specifically interested in cuneiform characters, but what you do is applicable to showing characters in any language. So let's say your primary settings are for English, but you want to show Hebrew or Spanish or any other language. How do you go about doing that? Well, as usual, Charlie, one of our forum administrators, points out how to do it. What you're going to do is go into System Preferences, and you're going to make sure you're in Language. I'm going to back up one space and show you. The Language pane is this one here that has the little blue flag on it. All right. Now, what you're going to do here, as you can see right now, all I've got in this is English. If I click here, where this plus sign is, I can then add a different language. As you can see, you got a lot of different language choices here. Hebrew is in here, Korean, a number of other languages, Spanish. Sometimes there are multiple variations of a language. When you click on that language, it will then get added to your list. And sometimes it will take just a second. And the system is then going to ask you if you would like to make that your primary language. And you can choose either to make it your primary language or to keep English. I'm going to keep English right now. I don't want to change all my settings and everything over to the other language. But that's essentially how you add it. You can set your keyboard preferences to accommodate that as well. You can do the same thing. You can set your keyboard to behave itself in that other language as well if you need to. That's not a function that I spend a lot of time with. I don't have to write in other languages, but if you do, that's a handy one. It's one that I sometimes forget is built into OS X. All right, let's move right along, and let's see what we got next. This particular one, I don't think too many of our members are going to have a little trouble with, but it's a good thing to know. One of our members tried to set up a dual boot system with Linux, and you can do that with the Mac. And if you're familiar with Linux, it's not a bad way to go because there's a lot of similarity with Unix being the underpinning of OS X. But here's the issue. Sometimes when you try to get rid of that Linux setup and you want to go back to an OS X setup, you get this little, I call it the international no symbol, that prohibited sign. The no parking thing, the no, you get that no symbol. And you can't quite figure out what's going on. Well, what's happened here, the machine doesn't want to boot to OS X. What's happened here is one of the little parts that frequently gets installed in Linux is the grub bootloader overwrites the original EFI partition that's on your hard drive. Now, EFI partition is what the Mac uses to boot from. Once that gets overwritten, your solution is going to end up essentially being, in most cases, completely reformat the drive. In other words, don't just boot to the recovery partition and expect that to fix it. You've got to completely reformat the drive and start all over from scratch. So if you're going to mess around with a Linux partition, make sure that you have a good clone of your original system, a bootable clone of your original system, or you at least are willing to do that kind of cleanup to get back to where you were once you decide to go backwards and back to OS X. That's it's a time. It can be a time-consuming thing to do, and that's one of the reasons a lot of people avoid it. Charlie had a good suggestion in his post about running Linux in a virtual machine. Now, he suggested VirtualBox because it's free, but you could do that with Parallels or any of the virtual machine software. And that way you avoid having to do the cleanup and erasing the drive to get rid of the grub bootloader and correcting that little problem. So the next one that I want to talk about, next little error that I want to talk about, once again, something that Randy contributed to. I was going to go into a little more depth about this. I'll probably save the in-depth discussion for another day. It has to do with uninterruptible power supplies, these backup units that give power when the electricity is out. And one of the reasons I linked to Randy's post is he talks about how important it is to have a UPS system that has voltage regulation. Now, different companies call it by different names. Some companies do not have it on their consumer level products, but it can be important. Voltage regulation sometimes is referred to by some companies as power line conditioning. What it's trying to do is to get rid of these sags and spikes in power. I know some of you, I'm sure, have encountered this. At a couple of places we've lived over the last few years, you would get a little bit of a power sag as the AC unit kicked on. You also get power spikes sometimes. If your power goes out, or when the power comes back on, you get a power spike. These sags and spikes can be murder, not just on your computer equipment, but digital equipment in general. We had a bread machine with one of those digital timers that, takes care of waiting so many hours and then starting the bread cycle or all these. And I think that's kind of what ruined the timer is it took one too many spikes. We didn't have it on an ups unit at the time. So Randy mentioned that, and I had forgotten to mention that. I'm going to go into a little more depth maybe next week. Uh, I was in the midst of researching that today when we had a pop-up storm, and I ended up shutting down the system for a little while because we were getting some pretty good lightning strikes nearby, and that's what made me think of sticking this in there. One of the other things that I strongly suggest that people look for is knowing for sure how the battery is managed in the unit that you buy. Having to have some of them have user replaceable batteries, some of them do not. With the ones that are not user replaceable, once the battery will no longer hold the charge. In other words, you've used it for a couple of years and now your power is on and the battery should be charging and it's just not holding a charge the way it should. If that battery is not user replaceable, then it's junk. But when you go to look for user replaceability, also take a look at two things. One is how difficult is it to find a replacement battery? And two, how much is that replacement battery going to cost? Somebody gave me a unit a couple of years ago, a second-hand one, and I thought to myself, I don't have an UFS unit, so I'll just take a look at this thing. I plugged it in, tried it out for a little bit, quickly figured out that the battery itself was not holding a charge. It was constantly giving me the low battery warning even when it shouldn't have. And so I, just for the heck of it, since the unit didn't cost me anything, I decided to do some poking around and see how much it was going to cost me to buy a replaceable battery. This particular unit had a user replaceable battery. Well, the cost of comparable units had come down between the time this unit was made and the time that I got a hold of it. The cost had come down to the point that I could have bought a new unit for what the battery cost me. So I decided it was not worth trying to spend the money to put a new battery in it. But that's one of the things that you want to take into consideration. Probably next week I'll have some more info on this, have a lot more tips, because we've hit that time of year. This is 2 or 3 Sunday nights in a row where my show prep has been interrupted by one type of storm concern or another. So somebody's trying to tell me that this is a topic we need to spend a little time on. All right, let's see what else we got in the stack of tricks this time. Okay, this one I like. I have been very fortunate in the sense that I have the same Magsafe adapter on my MacBook Pro that the unit came with. Now that's partly because over the last several years my MacBook Pro has been used primarily as a desktop machine. I haven't been carrying it around traveling from place to place. Well, because of that, my MagSafe adapter is in pretty good shape. But if you travel a lot, you may find that your MagSafe adapter has hit a point where it needs to be replaced. Maybe the cord is frayed or something else is going wrong. And as you start to traverse the internet looking for replacement, you'll find a wide variability in pricing. Some of them are very expensive. Some of them are much cheaper. And you start to wonder, well, why is that? Is this cheaper adapter as good a quality as what I have? Well, this article gives you an idea of some things that you should look for. Now, a lot of the things that they tell you, you really need your original adapter to look at and compare the two to be able to tell which one is fake. There are some really well made fakes out there, and really about the only way you're going to have some suspicions is to compare them side by side. My first suggestion is always order parts like this from a reputable vendor and know what their return policy is.
Fast tech doesn't count.
Because there are some places out there that I would not necessarily consider reputable vendors in the sense that they have a lot of knockoff gear. The knockoff gear may or may not be good quality. I can tell you from personal experience, I bought a iPad charger once, and it was one of these that was supposed to be able to charge two devices at once. I plugged it in. I had one device plugged in, and I've always used it that way because all I really wanted it for was to have a spare charging brick around. I plugged it in, and I probably used that thing every other day for a month. And then all of a sudden one day, I smelled the distinctive smell of burning electronics. And let's just say that was the end of that particular device. Looking back at it, there were some telltale signs that this was not your top quality adapter, one of which was price. It was considerably cheaper than a comparable Apple adapter. This article gives you some other ideas. You can look at the difference in printing, and the article shows you the different side by side, an original Apple adapter and then the knockoff. Some of these knockoffs are very, very good, which is why I say you have to be aware of what kind of reputation your vendor has and specifically what their return policy is. I'm not going to walk through the entire article, but there's some specific things, and you really need to be able to see the pictures to be able to tell what they're talking about. I have to admit, I did a poor job. I tried to pick out the fakes without reading through the description. I did a pretty poor job on that. So this is something that you really want to have a good adapter in front of you when you make the comparison. And that's the other reason I say you need a good idea of the return policy. If you get one that might be a fake or might not, even if it's legit is not the word I'm looking for. There are some knockoffs out there that are of decent quality, but if the one you get isn't, then you need to know where you can return it to get your money back, because you don't want to give yourself a lot of headaches plugging your expensive gear into a cheap adapter that's just not going to hold up. All right, next, this may take a second to load. This is something I've discussed before. I just wanted to quickly bring it back. It popped up again on iPhone Life. And this is, as you can see, Paula Bostrom. And it's from just a couple days ago. This is a reminder for those of you like myself that have fingers that just don't fit the iPhone keyboard, or even the iPad keyboard, which is a little bit bigger. I find it really cumbersome to try to hold on to the iPad and type at the same time. I can do it okay if I've got a few things to enter, but if I'm going to enter an extended amount of text, I want an alternative. And this particular article tells you how to pair a Bluetooth keyboard with your phone or your iPad. And there's a couple options that you could do. You could get a hold of a cheap USB keyboard. There are knockoff keyboards available all over the internet for $10 or $15, so you don't have to spend a fortune. Some of these work reasonably well given what you pay for them, and at that price, you could have one at work, one at home, and pair your iPhone or your iPad with it. Type using the keyboard. The other alternative is there are some companies, Logitech is one of them, that make keyboards that you can pair with multiple devices simultaneously. I have kicking around, I don't use it very much anymore because I've kind of damaged a couple of the keys, but one of the Logitech keyboards has 3 devices that you can pair with it, and you pick your which device you want to type into by tapping a key. The first key, for example, might be tied to your Mac. When you tap the second key, it might be your iPhone or iPad, whichever one you've paired with it. And then the third key could be something like either another iOS device, or you can actually use that keyboard with your Apple TV, typing in the search field of your Apple TV. And I like that type of keyboard if you're in a situation where your computer and your Apple TV are in the same room, because you can easily switch back and forth. I wish Apple would add this function to their keyboard, because I like Apple's keyboard. The one thing I miss is the ability to pair that keyboard with more than one device. So this tells you how to do it, and it's really simple. One of the first things you're going to want to do is make sure that you unpair your keyboard from any other device. Okay? And now you're going to make sure that you open the settings on your iPhone, tap the Bluetooth settings, make sure Bluetooth is on, and then locate the name of your Bluetooth keyboard. Now, you may have to do something to put your keyboard in discovery mode. How you do that varies slightly from keyboard to keyboard. But once you put it in discovery mode, it should show up in the list, and you select it, and from then on, you're ready to go. On the Apple keyboard, you're asked to type in a 4-digit code. For some other keyboards, there's something you'll have to do. For some of them, you're not. There's nothing special you have to do. You just go right ahead and start typing. But in either case, you can now use that keyboard with your iPhone or your iOS device. This is a very useful tip. One good way to make use, if you've got an old Bluetooth keyboard laying around, I wish I still had my old Apple Bluetooth keyboard. I'd probably use it for that. But it's a handy tip to keep around. I'll have a link to the article in the show notes. And then here's the other iPhone tip for this week, and it also applies to iPad, and that is battery drain. Now, a while ago, I wrote an article for the forum blog explaining that just because you've got an app down in your tray on the iPhone and it's open doesn't mean it's draining the battery. Okay? That in and of itself doesn't mean it's draining the battery. The prime candidate for battery drain is not that the app is left open,
telling your wife how to close an app,
but it's that's batteries and iPhones are an interesting thing around my house, because a while back my wife had an iPhone 3 that was behaving just the way she liked it, And except for one little thing, all of a sudden, the iPhone started draining battery real quickly. Instead of going several days without a charge, which she could do, it was now draining in a day, sometimes 2 days at most. And I started getting curious about what was going on. So I start poking around. And I discovered that there were several apps open. There's like 9 different apps open. And she never uses that many apps at one time. So it's like, what the heck is going on? Well, unfortunately, in my infinite stupidity, I had forgotten to tell her how to close an app as opposed to simply putting it down into out of the way so that you could switch to it later. Well, when I got to investigating, I started doing a little research. Could that be the cause of the power drain? And I found out that no, most of those apps were not draining power while they weren't being used. Except, here's the problem. There are some apps that are constantly or periodically checking in the background for updated information. And those apps can burn a lot of battery. If you've got the stock app set to update on the fly and it's checking, especially if you're having it check and you're having trouble getting a network connection. So if you've got, for example, this time of year, a lot of people will have their weather app open to check the weather. They forget to close it out. And if the weather information is set to update in the background, every time it goes up to get new weather information, that's burning a little more battery. And if you have a weak or spotty network connection or weak cell signal, then it's going to burn even more data as it's constantly trying to get a good enough signal to update that weather information. So here are some candidates, some culprits that you might want to look at. The Facebook app can do that if you got it set up, update in the background. Twitter, Google Maps, and I can tell you, we don't use the direction feature, to pull up directions on a map very often. But when I do, I can tell the difference in the drain that it puts on my phone. Okay? On the days when we have maps open, because it's checking and it's giving us directions where to turn, where to go, etc., 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 it's having to access the network more frequently to update and that kind of thing. It burns through battery. So here's some things that you can do. If you open the settings and tap on battery, and you're going to see a list of applications that use background app refresh. That's one of the ones you really want to look at. If you've got an app there that's set to refresh in the background and you really don't need it, turn it off so that it's not burning data in the background, refreshing in the background. And more important than the burning of the data for this discussion is the fact that every time it does a refresh, it's burning battery. So you can cut off any of those that you don't need. Another thing that you can do, I had not thought of this until I read it in the article, and this once again comes from iPhone Life, and this is, let's see, who? Connor Carey. I've referenced him before on the show. One of the things you can do to the Facebook app is instead of running the Facebook app, open Safari, go to Facebook and log in, and then tap on the share icon and basically choose to add it to your home screen. Okay? Now, this way you can use Safari It's one quick tap away because it's added to your home screen. But you don't have to have that uh, that application, the Facebook application, constantly updating in the background. The same could be done for some of the other social media applications. I'll leave it up to you, social media folks, to figure out which ones you can do that with, which ones you can't. If you've got some other battery saving tips, post them in the forum. I'm sure there are folks that would love to hear those. And that's going to just about do it for me this week, guys. As I said, next week I'll have a few more tips about things you would want to look for in the battery backup system. And I may have a few more tips and tricks. You'll notice I haven't said anything about the High Sierra beta yet. I'm going to wait until final release to talk about that because there's always changes in the beta. Things get updated, things get moved around. I'm testing the beta at the moment, as you can see. If you get a look at my background screen, this is what the background screen for High Sierra looks like. It's not my usual screen, as some of you know, but I'll save my comments for High Sierra until we get closer to final release date, and then I'll have some updated information for you on how quickly it performs, how to go about installing it, who wants to install it, why maybe you want to wait, who needs to wait, those kinds of things. But that will come up as we get closer and closer to the High Sierra release date. And that's going to just about do it for me this week, guys. Until next week, this has been your host, Sylvester Rock. I'm known as Sly Dude on the forum. So if you see me around during the week and you got a question, post it in the show thread, and I'll see if I can put it on the slate for next week and try to answer it.